Good morning, students. Today, we embark on a fascinating exploration of the role of myth in Plato's philosophy. Myths, often seen as mere stories, play a central role in Plato's dialogues, yet their significance is frequently misunderstood. Plato, known for his commitment to rational discourse and dialectical reasoning, uses myth not just as a narrative device, but as a critical method of conveying philosophical insights that transcend the limitations of logic. As we dive into this lecture, I encourage you to revisit the dialogues where Plato uses myths, particularly the Republic, the myth of error, Phaedo, the myth of the afterlife, Gorgias, the myth of judgment, and Phaedrus, the myth of the charioteer. These myths serve as more than illustrative tales. They are tools that Plato uses to engage the intellect and the emotions, offering a holistic vision of the human soul, justice, and the cosmos. To truly grasp Plato's approach to myth, I recommend spending time with these primary texts. They will deepen your understanding of how Plato combines narrative with philosophical discourse. Moreover, works like Timaeus, where myth merges with metaphysical inquiry, should also be part of your reading. In these works, Plato guides us to truths that lie beyond reason alone, and only by engaging fully with these texts can we appreciate the full scope of his philosophy. In our session today, we'll explore how myth operates on multiple levels in Plato's thought, offering pedagogical tools, conveying ineffable truths, and presenting moral lessons in ways that pure dialectic might not. As you read through these dialogues, I encourage you to reflect on the content of the myths and the function they serve in Plato's larger philosophical project. This material, like much of Plato's work, requires intellectual engagement and emotional and imaginative participation. By reading the reference books and engaging with the myths, you'll discover that Plato's philosophy is as much about the heart and soul as it is about the mind. Let's begin today by exploring what Plato understood by myth and its relationship to reason. Lecture 14, The Role of Myth in Plato's Philosophy. Good morning, students. Today, we'll be diving into an essential yet often misunderstood aspect of Plato's philosophy, the role of myth. We tend to think of philosophy as being about argumentation, logic, and abstract reasoning. Yet, if we delve into Plato's dialogues, we find that myth plays a crucial role. Some of Plato's most famous and philosophically rich ideas come not through dialectic alone, but through narratives, fables, and myths. The myth of error, for instance, concludes the Republic and leaves us with a striking vision of the soul's fate after death, something meant to encapsulate and clarify complex philosophical ideas. Why does Plato, a philosopher so committed to the rational and the analytical, rely on such mythic storytelling? Today we'll explore the function and importance of myth in Plato's works. Myths in Plato's writings serve several purposes. They act as pedagogical tools, communicate ineffable truths, and convey moral and metaphysical insights in a way that dialectic might not. Let us begin by discussing what a myth meant for Plato. Myth as a pedagogical tool. To understand why Plato uses myth, it is useful to examine how he differentiates between mythos, myth, and logos, reasoned discourse. In many dialogues, myth appears when the limits of human reason seem to be reached. This is not because Plato is abandoning rational discourse, but because he believes that some truths can only be communicated through narrative. Myths allow us to grapple with ideas that resist being broken down into purely logical terms. A primary example of this function is found in the Phaedo, where Plato gives a mythological account of the afterlife. In this dialogue, Socrates, just before drinking the hemlock, recounts a myth about the soul's journey after death. The myth describes the soul's judgment and its placement in either a heavenly or hellish afterlife, depending on how justly the person has lived. Phaedo 113d. What's crucial here is that Plato uses this myth not merely to entertain, but to communicate something profound about justice and the immortality of the soul. It brings the abstract idea of the soul's immortality into a vivid, imaginable form for the listener. Moreover, Plato is not unique in using myth as a pedagogical tool. We find a similar function in Hesiod's Theogony and Homer's Iliad, where myth serves as a vehicle for teaching moral lessons. However, Plato's use of myth is distinct because he uses it to drive home philosophical arguments already made in dialectic, acting almost like an exclamation point or summation. In the Phaedo, the soul's immortality is not merely stated as a conclusion from reason, it is also symbolized in myth, making the argument more persuasive and emotionally resonant. Myth as conveying ineffable truths. A second function of myth in Plato's work is to convey truths that are beyond human understanding, what we might call ineffable truths. These are truths that cannot be fully grasped by reason alone and must instead be intuited or felt. Myth allows Plato to gesture towards these higher truths without claiming to know them in full. The myth of error, found at the conclusion of the Republic, is perhaps the most famous example of this use of myth. After spending 10 books examining justice, Plato closes his monumental work with a story about a man named who dies in battle and is brought back to life to recount what happens to the soul after death. Republic 614b. Describes how souls are judged and sent to either heaven or hell, but then the myth goes further, recounting how souls are reincarnated and choose their next life, with the wise choosing a virtuous life and the foolish choosing one of excess or tyranny. Republic 619 BD. This myth serves a few purposes. On one level, it summarizes many of the themes discussed throughout the Republic, such as the nature of justice and the importance of living a virtuous life. However, on a deeper level, it also points to something that lies beyond rational comprehension, the ultimate fate of the soul. Plato's dialectic may suggest the immortality of the soul, but the myth of illustrates this immortality in a way that reason alone cannot. Through myth, Plato communicates an intuitive, emotional truth about the soul's journey that logic and dialectic could never fully capture. It is important to note here that Plato's use of myth should not be understood as a dismissal of reason. Rather, he uses myth to supplement reason. As we see in the Phaedrus, myth and reason work together to give us a fuller picture of reality. In that dialogue, Socrates gives the famous myth of the charioteer, in which he describes the soul as a charioteer trying to control two horses, one representing the rational part of the soul and the other representing the appetitive part. Phaedrus 246ab. This image, while mythological, perfectly encapsulates Plato's complex theory of the tripartite soul, and it is difficult to imagine a more compelling way to communicate this idea. The moral function of myth in Plato also serves a moral function. It often acts as a way of reinforcing ethical and metaphysical insights, giving them a deeper resonance. Plato is acutely aware that philosophy is not just an intellectual activity, it is also a moral one. The myth of error is not just an account of the afterlife, but a reminder of the stakes of our moral choices in this life. By giving a vivid, imaginative account of the soul's fate, Plato reinforces the urgency of living a just life. Similarly, in the Gorgias, Plato uses the myth of judgment to reinforce Socrates' argument that it is better to suffer injustice than to commit it. In this myth, Socrates describes how, after death, souls are judged by three judges, Rhadamanthus, Iacchus, and Minos, who determine whether they will go to the Isles of the Blessed or to Tartarus. Gorgias 523a, 527a. This myth comes at the end of a dialogue that has been entirely devoted to an examination of justice and the nature of power. The myth, then, is not an afterthought, but a way of making the stakes of the argument more immediate and emotionally compelling. What's more, the myth taps into something deeply human, our fear of punishment and our hope for reward. Plato recognizes that people are not always moved by reason alone, and so he uses myth to make his ethical teachings more visceral. The myth of error and the myth of judgment in the Gorgias both serve as moral exemplars, showing us the consequences of living either a just or unjust life. Metaphysical insights through myth. Lastly, myth allows Plato to explore metaphysical concepts that are difficult, if not impossible, to express through reasoned argument alone. One of the clearest examples of this comes in the Timaeus, where Plato recounts a myth about the creation of the universe. In this dialogue, Timaeus describes how a divine craftsman, the demiurge, fashioned the universe based on an eternal, perfect model, Timaeus 28a. This story offers an account of the origins of the cosmos that is mythological rather than scientific, but it also conveys deep metaphysical insights about the nature of order, chaos, and the eternal forms. In fact, this myth mirrors Plato's theory of forms, which posits that the material world is only a shadow of a higher, more perfect reality. Just as the demiurge creates the material world by looking to the eternal forms as a model, so too do we, in our quest for knowledge, look beyond the material world to grasp the forms. The Timaeus myth thus functions as a metaphysical allegory, helping us to understand Plato's theory of the relationship between the material and the immaterial worlds. Another fascinating example comes from the Phaedrus, where Plato uses the myth of the soul's ascent to the realm of the forms to explore the nature of beauty and knowledge. In this myth, souls are described as chariots trying to ascend to the heavens, where they can glimpse the eternal forms. Only the souls that are able to control their horses and maintain a balance between reason and desire can reach this divine realm. Phaedrus 248c, 250c. Here, Plato uses myth to articulate his metaphysical vision of the soul's journey towards truth, beauty, and the divine. Conclusion: the power of myth in Plato's thought. In conclusion, myth in Plato's philosophy is not an ornamental or secondary feature. It is central to his method of teaching and exploring the human condition. Myths serve as pedagogical tools that make philosophical ideas more accessible. They convey truths that reason alone cannot grasp. They reinforce moral lessons, and they allow Plato to explore metaphysical concepts in a way that resonates with our deepest intuitions. The myth of air reminds us of the soul's ultimate fate and the importance of living a just life, while myths like the charioteer in the Phaedrus and the demiurge in the Timaeus give us metaphysical insights into the nature of the soul and the cosmos. Through these myths, Plato invites us to engage not just with our minds, but with our hearts and imaginations. Myth, in other words, is an essential part of the Platonic project of understanding the nature of reality and the good life. As you continue your study of Plato, I encourage you to pay close attention to the myths in his dialogues. Far from being mere literary embellishments, they offer crucial insights into Plato's philosophy. By reflecting on these myths, we can gain a deeper appreciation of Plato's unique approach to conveying truth, one that does not rely on reason alone, but instead seeks to engage every part of the soul, rational, emotional, and imaginative. Plato's myths serve as a bridge between the abstract realm of philosophical concepts and the concrete, everyday experiences of human life. They remind us that while reason is essential, it is not sufficient by itself. True wisdom requires us to look beyond reason and embrace the whole of our humanity. In closing, remember that Plato did not see myth and reason as opposing forces. Instead, he used them together to create a more holistic form of philosophy. This is why his dialogues continue to resonate with us today. They speak to both our intellect and our emotions, challenging us not just to think, but to feel and imagine. The myths of Plato, particularly those like the myth of air, offer us windows into profound truths about existence, morality, and the soul. Truths that transcend the limits of rational discourse. Thank you for your attention, and I encourage you to explore the myths we've discussed today as you continue your journey through Plato's works. They are as essential to understanding his philosophy as any syllogism or logical argument.